Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast.
Today, we are really diving into something huge. We're plunging into the world of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, but we're doing it through a really contemporary lens.
Right.
Our goal isn't just to, summarize the plots. We want to explore the staggering structural and historical depth that modern scholarship has uncovered.
Exactly. We've gone through a huge stack of research for this deep dive, and we're leaning heavily on the work of a really brilliant German classical philologist, the late Joachim Lataz.
Oh, absolutely.
His insights, they didn't just tweak old theories, they fundamentally showed how these ancient epics work as a kind of structured memory.
A structured memory, yeah, that's the key phrase.
And it gives us this astonishingly direct connection right back to the Greek Bronze Age, hundreds of years before anyone even wrote these poems down.
So our mission today is pretty comprehensive. We really need to unpack the final resolution of that centuries-old Homeric question about who the author was.
It's old chestnut.
Then we've got to analyze the narrative technique, which is just masterful. We'll focus on the engine of the whole Iliad-Achilles rage, his monas.
And how that one emotion basically dictates the entire story.
The entire story. And finally, we'll connect the myth of Troy to actual documented history.
That sounds like a journey through deep time. So let's start with the scholar who kind of drew the map for us.
Yeah, let's start with Joachim Lataz. When you talk about modern Homeric studies, you really have to start with him. He dedicated his entire professional life to this field, a true pillar of classical philology for decades.
I've read that his colleagues often talked about his unique mix of qualities, not just the intellectual rigor, but his wit, his energy, his esprit.
That's right. But academically, his name is absolutely linked to the definitive scholarly work of a generation. The Basilar Homer Commentary, the Basil Homer Commentary.
And what was it about that commentary that made it so groundbreaking?
Well, it really speaks to his whole philosophy. Its accessibility.
Right.
Sure, it had the highest scholarly competence, absolutely top tier, but people who worked with him said he always insisted on translations and analysis that were fresh and direct.
So not just dry academic prose.
Not at all. He saw Homer as a living text, not some dusty relic.
And that leads right into his core idea, doesn't it? The unbroken presence of Homer.
It does. He tracked the epic's influence across millennia. You can see it everywhere, from ancient vase paintings and sculptures through medieval manuscripts and then all the way into modern movies and even video games.
He argued that almost every major historical era kind of turns back to Homer, right, as a mirror for its own problems and dreams.
A mirror, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to mention the authenticity he brought to it. His colleagues often said he was deeply dedicated to the values in the epic's: courage, truthfulness, justice. He treated someone like Achilles not just as a character, but as a real ideal, however flawed.
So let's talk about the intellectual battlefield he helped to clear, the infamous Homeric question. This was a huge deal for a long, long time.
Oh, a massive deal. Since the late 18th century, the whole field was just fractured. If you were a serious Homerist, you had to pick a side. You were one of two warring factions.
Okay, so on one side you had the analysts.
Right. The analysts, they treated the texts like historical documents to be dissected. They meticulously cataloged every little inconsistency, every repetition, every shift in style.
And they saw the Iliad and the Odyssey as these huge patchwork cults.
Exactly. Pieced together from older, shorter songs by different hands or maybe later editors. For them, Homer wasn't a singular genius. He was more like a talented, maybe slightly careless collector.
And then on the other side,
The Unitarians. They were completely opposed. They championed the structural and thematic unity of the poems.
they saw a single vision.
A single, brilliant vision. They insisted that the coherence, the emotional drive, the sheer architectural genius of a poem like the Iliad could only be the work of a single author, Homer, designing it as one integrated piece of art.
So for them, artistic genius explained away any minor little slips.
Right, this debate was just relentless. But the big aha moment, the thing that finally allowed the controversy to be acted to be put aside, was the universal acceptance of the oral poetry theory.
Which was pioneered by Milman Parry and Albert Lord, and then really amplified by scholars like Latach.
Yes, and this was a genuine paradigm shift. It wasn't about picking a winner between the analysts and the Unitarians. It reframed the entire way we look at how literature can even be created.
So what did it establish?
It established that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not, spontaneous written compositions penned by some guy in his study. They were the final written product of centuries of high-demand improvisation and oral
Well,
performance.
formed by these specialized singer poets, the Aioidoi.
Exactly. And when you say oral tradition, it's easy to think of, like, simple folk songs around a campfire.
But this was something else entirely.
Oh, this was high art. It was a brutal apprenticeship. And Iodos had to be able to recite thousands of lines, the whole epic from memory, while simultaneously constructing the verse on the fly to keep that hexameter rhythm going.
Wow, that would require decades of training.
Decades. Memorizing this vast internal library of standardized phrases or formulas that could be slotted in to fit any metrical situation.
So Homer, the singular author who eventually dictated the final written version around the 8th century BCE, he was the master synthesizer.
Here's the culmination.
Re-
He stood at the end of this immense oral river. He took this gigantic storehouse of traditional formulas, episodes, alternate versions he'd learned and performed his whole life.
he crystallized it.
He crystallized it. And this immediately solves the analyst's problem. If Homer is drawing on a tradition that's hundreds of years deep, of course, a little archaic word or a slight inconsistency from an older version of the story might slip in.
So those little slips aren't evidence of a sloppy editor.
No. They're the signature. They're the proof of the oral tradition itself. They prove that one brilliant mind Homer took this enormous fluid tradition and shaped it into a single, unified, coherent work that still had the marks of its long journey.
He was the master composer who edited and structured all that material to tell his specific version of the story.
Exactly. The rage of Achilles and the return of Odysseus.
And that realization that opens up this next part, which is just mind-blowing. The idea of the poems as a structured memory.
Yes, the idea that they preserve genuine, deep Bronze Age data across the so-called Greek Dark Ages.
How is that even possible?
Well, the whole thing hinges on the linguistic structure, specifically those formulas we mentioned, these metrically accurate word combinations that are the building blocks of improvisation.
So things like shepherd of the peoples for a king, or radiant Hector.
Right. They fit the hexameter, they identify the character, and crucially, they buy the singer a split second to think of the next line.
But the key insight, the sources say, is that the hexameter, that strict 6-footed meter, it wasn't just for performance, it was a stabilization mechanism.
It was during the long Greek literacy gap, the Schriftlichkeitslücke. This is the period between the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces around 1200 BCE and the adoption of the alphabet around 800 BCE. 400 years with no writing.
And language changes a lot in 400 years. Sounds shift, grammar evolves. How does a meter stop that?
That's the genius of it. The meter acts as a constraint, a linguistic straitjacket almost. If a singer tried to change a word to its modern, evolved pronunciation, the whole line would often just fall apart metrically.
It wouldn't scan.
It wouldn't scan. So to keep the rhythm, to finish the line, the singer was forced to use the older, archaic form of the word or phrase, the one that worked.
So the rhythm itself became a time capsule. It protected the old language because if you modernized it, you couldn't sing the song properly.
Precisely. And this is where the linguistic archaeology gets so exciting. The Mariones example is the absolute crown jewel of this evidence. It's concrete proof.
Okay, let's break that down. Mariones is a secondary character, but he has this standard formulaic line describing him.
Brisis itillatus Arius, which means Mariones equal to Ares, destroyer of men.
A pretty standard epic description.
Right. But if you scan that line in the Greek of Homer's time, the 8th century, the meter is broken. It's unmetrical. An old school analyst would have pointed to that and said, see? A later bard messed up the line.
But the new linguistic evidence says the complete opposite.
A complete opposite. Using known rules of sound change, linguists can reconstruct that line, taking it back to its presumed Mycenaean form, the language spoken in the Bronze Age.
And what does that reconstructed line look like?
It looks like Mariones hatalantos enualishi an quanti.
And the punchline.
That reconstructed line is metrically perfect. It flows flawlessly in the hexameter.
Wow. So that suggests the formula describing Mariones was actually coined back when Mycenaean was a living language.
Potentially as far back as the 15th century BCE, a full 700 years before Homer.
That is just incredible. That Bronze Age piece of data was carried, intact, protected by the rhythm, through the entire Dark Age until Homer wrote it down.
It's deep time preservation. And this persistence of data is what gave scholars the confidence to finally bridge the gap between myth and history. which led to this revolution in thinking called the Oriental Turn.
We tend to think of ancient Greece in isolation, don't we? The Greek miracle.
We do. And the Oriental Turn basically says that idea is fundamentally wrong. It acknowledges that Mycenaean Greece wasn't isolated at all. It was deeply integrated into a larger Asian, Eastern, Mediterranean koinonia community.
A community of shared culture, trade, politics.
Right, that included the Near East, Egypt, and especially the powerful Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey.
And this is revolutionary because it moves the Trojan War from pure myth into verifiable geopolitics. We can actually compare names and places from the epics with non-Greek state documents.
Specifically, the huge cuneiform archives they found at Hattusa, the Hittite capital.
And the correlations are strong?
They're so strong they're now widely accepted. The Hittite documents talk all the time about a kingdom in western Anatolia called Wilusa,
Which is identified with Homer's Wilios, or Ilios.
the poet's main name for Troy.
So Troy wasn't just a fantasy setting, it was a real strategic city, perfectly placed for trade between Europe and the powers of Asia.
And there's more. The Hittite letters, especially ones about geopolitical tensions, they mention a land called Ahijawa.
Aisha.
Ahijawa is identified with the Achaioi, the Mycenaean Greeks. That's the name Homer consistently uses for the entire Greek army besieging Troy.
So you have linguistic evidence like the Marionis formula, you have archaeological evidence from the site of Troy, and now you have documentary evidence from the Hittites.
It all converges. The historical setting of a major conflict in that region becomes basically undeniable. The epic is transformed from a fairy tale into a historical echo.
An echo captured and preserved by the rhythm of the oral poets. Amazing. Okay, let's shift from the poem's origins to its internal engine, the Iliad itself.
Right. It's so easy to think of it as this sprawling war chronicle, a Troya panorama. But it's not. It is laser-focused, structurally unified, and it's all driven by one single motivation.
And that is the manis.
The madness, the groll, the superhuman rage of Achilles. The entire poem, which only covers about 60 days of the war, is dictated by the progression and the ultimate resolution of that fury.
It starts in book 1 and it doesn't end until book 24.
Which means every major event, every Greek defeat, every Trojan victory is a direct result of Achilles pulling himself out of the war.
And the initial conflict just sets that engine in motion.
It begins with Agamemnon, the High King, showing just catastrophic hubris. He insults Chryses, a priest of Apollo, and the gods sends a plague that just decimates the Achaean army.
So Agamemnon is forced to give the priest's daughter back. But then, to save face, he commits the ultimate offense against his best warrior.
The ultimate offense. He demands Briseis, Achilles' own war prize, his Ergeshenk.
This wasn't just about a woman, though. It was about something much deeper.
Oh, much deeper. It was about Timea, public honor, the standing Achilles had earned with his skill in battle. Agamemnon strips him of that in public, essentially declaring that Achilles' power means nothing under his command.
And that violation is what ignites the Meris. Achilles appeals to his goddess mother Thetis, and she lays down the ban.
The absolute ban. Achilles must be completely inactive. No fighting, no advising, nothing, until Agamemnon is humbled and the Greeks are dying at their own ships. And Zeus agrees. The plot is now locked in.
The crucial test of this rage comes in Book 9, with the failed embassy. The Greeks are facing annihilation. Hector is just tearing them apart.
And Agamemnon finally tries to buy Achilles back.
And the offer he makes is just, it's monumental.
It's breathtaking. Vast amounts of gold, silver, Briseis returned untouched, 12 fast horses, 7 women from Lesbos, and the promise to marry one of his daughters with 7 rich cities as her dowry.
He basically offers to make Achilles a co-ruler.
Right. If the issue were just about material wealth, the Geras, Achilles should have accepted instantly. He would have been more powerful than Agamemnon himself.
But he refuses.
He refuses. And this is the key to the whole moral structure of the Iliad. As the sources point out, Agamemnon completely misses the point. Even after listing all those riches, he ends his offer by demanding Achilles, Beugen soll sich. He should submit.
He still can't bring himself to give Achilles the one thing he actually needs.
A real apology, an admission that he violated Achilles' Timea. He sees his action as a tactical mistake that needs material compensation, not a moral crime that needs repentance.
And because he can't do that, Achilles rejects the offer, the ban stays in place, and the disaster gets worse.
Hector achieves his destiny. He pushes the Greeks back to their walls. He sets fire to the ships. The Greeks are truly cornered, fulfilling Thetis' prophecy.
And this is where Patroclus comes in.
Patroclus. He begs Achilles to let him enter the battle, but since Achilles can't break his ban, Patroclus persuades him to let him go instead, wearing Achilles' famous, terrifying armor.
The idea was just to push the Trojans back from the ships.
Just that. But Patroclus gets swept up in the success of the disguise. He pushes too far, and he's killed by Hector.
And that death is the final catalyst.
It immediately lifts Thetis' ban. The meanness of Achilles, which was aimed at Agamemnon for his dishonor, now refocuses with this absolute terrifying ferocity on Hector.
In Book 19, the new shield arrives from the god Hephaestus, and the slaughter begins. The text describes a fury that's almost inhuman. Achilles wishes he could eat Hector's raw flesh. Its grief turned into pure violence. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
But that fury, it has to be contained for the poem to reach its full meaning. After Achilles kills Hector, he keeps defiling the body, dragging it around Patroclus' tomb for 11 straight days. This is a violation of all sacred laws of burial.
Which forces the gods to finally step in. Zeus sends Thetis to her son and Iris to King Priam.
And the old king has to go, alone, guided by the god Hermes, into the enemy camp to ransom his son's body.
The final book, Book 24, it's the emotional heart of the Iliad. Priam kneels before the man who killed his son and begs for the body.
And Achilles, looking at this old man, is reminded of his own father, Peleus. And he's finally overcome by this shared human sorrow, by empathy.
He relents. He allows Hector's body to be prepared and mourned. And the genius is that this poem, which is all about rage and war, doesn't end with a final battle. It ends with a funeral, a temporary return to shared humanity.
It's just incredible. And Homer's genius isn't just in that grand structure, it's also in the subtle, sophisticated narrative craft he used, a technique called focalization.
Right. As modern readers, we hate repetition, but Homer uses it deliberately. Focalization is telling the same event twice from different perspectives.
And old scholars used to see this as a flaw. The ancient critic Aristarchus actually wanted to cut the scene where Achilles repeats the whole story of his argument with Agamemnon.
But it serves a really important purpose in an oral context, doesn't it?
A hugely important purpose. In Book 1, the main narrator tells us, the audience, about the dispute. Then Achilles repeats the exact same story in detail to his mother, Thetis.
Why? Why do it twice?
Well, in a world without books, where listeners might get distracted, repetition reinforces the core motivation. By having Achilles tell the story himself, the narrator makes sure Thetis isn't just informed, she is fully convinced of the profound injustice done to her son.
And her conviction is what drives the plot.
It's the engine. She has to be emotionally invested to go to Zeus and persuade him to favor the Trojans. So focalization isn't a mistake, it's a brilliant device to mobilize a character's psychology to justify a major plot turn.
So clever. Now, let's pivot to the Odyssey. Structurally, it's a completely different kind of beast.
A different challenge, absolutely. It focuses on just the last 40 days of Odysseus' 20-year journey home. 10 years of war, 10 years of wandering.
So the problem for Homer was how to get all that backstory in those 10 years of adventures without stopping the main story dead in its tracks.
And he solves this with one of the most famous literary devices ever, the facies, the great flashback narrative in books 9 through 12.
This is Odysseus' I-adventure narrative. He tells his whole story to the Phaeacians, King Alcinous, and Queen Arete.
And it lets Homer bring in all those fantastic legendary adventures retrospectively. We get the whole sequence, starting right after Troy fell.
Yeah.
First, the Cicons.
Right, they sack a city, get greedy, hang around too long, and get attacked. 72 men lost. An immediate lesson about hubris.
Then they meet the Lotus Eaters. Not a military threat, but a psychological one. The drug makes the men lose all desire to go home, which threatens the whole point of the poem, the Nostos.
Odysseus has to literally drag them back to the ships.
And then, of course, the Cyclops, Polyphemus. 6 men eaten alive. Odysseus shows his cunning by blinding the giant and using the nobody trick to escape.
But this is also where his human flaw, his pride, gets him into trouble.
Big trouble. As he's sailing away, he can't resist taunting the giant, shouting his real name.
Which is a catastrophic mistake.
Because it lets Polyphemus call on his father, the sea god Poseidon, to curse him. That one single act of pride is the source of his entire decade of wandering.
We also get Circe, the enchantress who turns his men into pigs. Odysseus, protected by a magic herb from Hermes, resists her, but then stays with her for a whole year.
Then he has to navigate these impossible maritime horrors, the sirens, whose songs promise a destructive knowledge. He has his men plug their ears with wax, but has himself tied to the mast so he can hear it without being destroyed.
And then the ultimate no-win scenario, Scylla and Charybdis.
The impossible choice. Steer near Scylla, the six-headed monster, who's guaranteed to eat 6 of his men, or steer near Charybdis, the whirlpool, and risk losing the entire ship and crew.
And he chooses the certain loss of 6 over the possible loss of all, a devastating moment of leadership.
It is. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, things are dire. These arrogant suitors have taken over his palace, eating his food, drinking his wine, and pressuring his wife, Penelope, to remarry.
But she's a model of cunning herself. The famous trick with the burial shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes. Weaving by day, unraveling by night, stalling for years.
And at the same time, their son, Telemachus, guided by the goddess Athene, goes on his own journey to find news of his father, maturing into a man who can help defend the house.
And it all builds to that spectacular climax. Odysseus returns disguised as a beggar, endures all the abuse, wins the impossible bow contest, and then unleashes that brutal, violent slaughter of all the suitors.
It's the restoration of order through necessary violence.
It's fascinating. The Iliad is structured by the rage that removes the hero from the battle, and the Odyssey is structured by the cunning that allows the hero to return in secret to restore it.
And if the Iliad is the foundation for tragedy, the Odyssey is really the foundation for the novel. This is why the Tass and others see Homer as the undisputed founder of European literature.
His influence didn't just stop with the Greeks either. It became the absolute bedrock of Roman intellectual life.
Right. Livius Andronicus first translated the Odyssey into Latin, the Odusia. But the real institutionalization came with Virgil.
With the Aeneas.
Virgil's Aeneas does this magnificent synthesis. It takes the big themes from both epics. The 10 years of war, like the Iliad, followed by the journey and foundation story like the Odyssey, and merges them into a new national epic for Rome.
And that act sort of Romanized Homer, locking him into Europe's intellectual DNA forever.
For 2,800 years, the figures and ideas have been shaping culture.
And it's everywhere today. The names Odysseus, Penelope, Achilles, Scylla, and Charybdis, they're all still metaphors we use. I mean, we still say, I had a real Odyssey today to describe a frustrating trip to the DMV.
It's true. But this leads to a provocative thought that comes out of Latasse's work about how we receive Homer today. You see this sharp split.
On one hand, you get these deep, sophisticated intellectual works, James Joyce's Ulysses mapping the Odyssey onto 20th century Dublin.
Exactly. Serious, deep engagement. But on the other hand, most of the cultural references we see now are, well, they're shallow. They're crude distortions.
They keep the name, but they strip out all the substance.
A character in a cartoon, a movie title, all the moral and psychological depth is just gone. And the challenge for us is to recognize which kind of engagement we're doing. Are we really grappling with Homer's big questions, or are we just using the names as empty cultural shorthand?
It makes you wonder, if the Bronze Age singers needed that rigid meter to protect the deep truths in the story, what protective structure do we have today to keep us from just stripping these texts for parts?
That is the real question, isn't it? What was it about Homer's vision, his focus on human struggle, on honor and fate, on the brutal consequences of our actions that made these texts survive for almost 3 millennia? That focus on the human condition is why reading Homer still feels like looking in the mirror.
So let's make sure you walk away with the most critical takeaways from this deep dive, the central statements that Latasse really brought to light.
First, the Homeric epics are not spontaneous compositions. They're the final, crystallized form of centuries of a professional oral poetry tradition.
Second, the linguistic evidence, like that amazing Marionis formula, confirms that core parts of the epic tradition go all the way back to the Mycenaean Bronze Age, maybe 7 centuries before Homer.
Third, the Iliad is a unified whole, driven entirely by the Mauryans, the rage of Achilles. That one emotion dictates the entire narrative arc from beginning to end.
Fourth, Homer used advanced narrative techniques like focalization, that's strategic repetition, not as a mistake, but to explore psychological depth and to drive the plot forward.
And finally, Homer's works truly established the foundation for all European literature that followed, permanently linking myth with the historical realities of the Bronze Age in a way that still defines our culture today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unbroken presence of Homer. We hope you enjoyed the journey and maybe feel inspired to look at those ancient texts with fresh eyes.
Until next time.